Hey everybody, Wayne Davies here from Spectrum Economics. I am still on my market structure series. I think we are now on our fourth or fifth video. Fifth video in total, fourth video if we're talking about going into detail on a particular market structure. So just a quick recap of where we're at with the series so far. So I started off with an introduction video. I then went into perfect competition, then monopolistic competition, then oligopoly. And today I'm going to be doing Monopoly. Yeah, a lot of you get excited about Monopoly, hey? A lot of you are like, yeah, Monopoly, bad. Or if you're, thinking of the game, a lot of fun. Probably one of the best games ever made, I think. It's by Hasbro anyway. Monopoly is very, very, very popular. Okay, so in addition to this video series, I also have a written post series. And you can find the links to those posts down in the descriptions for this on whether on DTube or DLive. I think we're on DLive. Also definitely on Steemit. So the Steam, if you go to the post there on Steemit, you'll see the descriptions and the links. If you're looking at this at YouTube, I don't think we have links on there, though you should be able to find my videos on there anyway. But there'll be a link, if you're watching this on YouTube, to my Steemit page, and everything is on Steemit. I pretty much keep it all on Steemit now, and for video streaming and all that, I pretty much go with what's on the blockchain. And if you're watching this on YouTube, this is more of a backup video if anything else. So anyway, just get that out of the way. So okay, let's talk about Monopoly. I think most people, even if you're not an economist, probably knows what a monopoly is. It's pretty straightforward really. Monopoly, just one seller. That's all it is. One seller. That is in the strict sense, by the way. You could have a monopoly in the sense that you have one seller that has like 90% of the market share or something. Essentially still a monopoly, but that other 10% could be by a lot of other firms, and you get that sometimes. You can probably see that more in the private sector, but there are very few private sector monopolies. It's very, very rare. Most monopolies are actually by government, and they tend to hold a monopoly power simply because they make it illegal to compete with them, essentially anyway. So okay, so let's go through the characteristics of a monopoly. So it's quite similar to oligopoly in the sense that you normally have many buyers. You can have a monopoly-monopsony situation. I'm not going to go into that, but in my next video though, I'll be talking about monopsony, so treating them as two separate, but in theory they can run together. You also have barriers to entry, and very, very, very stiff barriers to entry since you just get the one firm. And if it's government regulation, that could be the case. They just allow one and nobody else, simply blocked out. It could be other things like economies of scale. Simply firms cannot get their entry because the economies of scale are so great, they just can't compete. You could also have massive infrastructure costs to actually get set up, for example, or we could look at it in terms of water, whatever. You need to have a massive amount of infrastructure, or electricity and power, the power stations, all of that. A lot of investment in order to get started, and firms just don't have that, so they can't get in. And you can even have patents as well that potentially can keep firms out too. You probably have more oligopoly in that nature, but it can work for monopolies as well. So okay, so what are our big monopolies? It tends to be government, as you can see here. And what does government monopolies have a reputation for being? Yeah, that's right, a reputation for being inefficient. Basically not getting much done, and simply because there is no competition. No matter how badly a government monopoly performs, it can basically just keep going forever because it's they're getting their funding from taxpayers, and taxpayers pay their tax, it goes to monopoly, and it keeps going and going and going and going. So in theory it could be making massive, massive losses, completely inefficient. Basically what you kind of get in communist countries. I'm not dishing Russia or China or whatever, but there's great inefficiencies there simply because of government-owned industries, and there's very little incentive to actually do things well. Like in the private sector, there's incentive to get profits, right? Even with private monopolies, they still want to make profits. In the government, you don't have that. All they have to do is keep things churning over. And a lot of times the objectives are not around efficiency, not around about making things better, but it's around of a control thing, especially if you've watched the TV series Yes Prime Minister, or Yes Minister, I think this is the older one, you find that the bureaucrats, they're more interested in keeping control of things rather than actually making things better. So it's about getting a larger budget. So to get a larger budget, you have to expand your existing budget. Whether it's on good things or bad things, it doesn't matter. It's about having more people under you. So there's the prestige of, being a general manager with 10,000 people, which is better than 5,000 people, which is better than 2,000 people. So there's very different objectives around how government monopolies work. And mostly it isn't about making things better for you or I. So there will be people that argue that there's greater fairness in terms of pricing and stuff like that. Yeah, maybe the prices are going to be lower. Possibly. Of course they're going to make massive losses, but who's actually still paying for this? You're still paying for this through your taxes. So you may be paying directly, it might be less, but then what you're paying in taxes is going way through the roof because of their inefficiency. So kind of don't be fooled by that one, by lower prices and loss making by government bodies, whatever. So what's some good examples of monopolies in government? And you'd have electricity and you'd have water. They could be private, potentially. These could be private, and if they're privatized, they tend to actually become oligopolies rather than monopolies, rather than a private monopoly. So if it becomes a private monopoly, then it's still somewhat regulated by government in terms of what they're offering. Then there may be more incentive to actually provide a better service because now there's profits at stake and you have shareholders to please and so on. But a lot of governments still have like water and electricity, it's still government owned, and they consider them as being essential. Everybody needs water, everybody needs electricity. So these are very critical, and critical industries government will always like to hold on to keep them going, even if they are very poorly run. In terms of private monopolies, I mentioned they are very rare, but I've got two examples here potentially. We have Google and we have Microsoft. And I would arguably put both of those into oligopoly structures, not monopoly, but at times I think there was one time where Microsoft had a very large market share and had a lot of monopoly power, if we call it that, even if they weren't monopolies, but they had monopoly power, and they would have control over supply and over the quantity and the price and all of that sort of thing. It'd be like companies would be using Microsoft, and all they would use is Microsoft. You need Microsoft products for compatibility and all of that stuff. And other firms couldn't get in there. Like I know Apple is now a much bigger competitor to Microsoft, and there's a few others as well. I think there was like Linux as well was competing with Microsoft, so Windows. So it was very powerful. And Google as well. They have monopoly power, but I'd arguably say that it is still an oligopoly because you still in terms of search engine, like Google's an interesting one because they own so many companies that they're in a lot of different markets. Let's just take it in terms of the search engines. So you have Google, but there's competitors. Again, you can even say Microsoft. They've got Bing, you've got Yahoo. What was it? Ask Jesus. That's still around. I don't even know. But they have quite a grip on the search engine anyway, and that's pretty powerful. So again, I would still call it monopoly power rather than outright monopoly. You have to do a check what the concentration ratio would be of Google, but I think Bing has eaten a little bit into that market share. It's again by Microsoft, so it's big companies competing with each other. So let's just take a look here at the graphs. I know if you young economists, you get these in school and stuff, so you probably want to understand a little bit more about that. I'm just going to go cover this very briefly. This is not really intended for a pure economics audience. It's a bit more general, just to give people an idea about what economics are. But anyway, so what you'll notice here, your graph, you've got your demand and you have your supply. So your supply essentially is your marginal cost and your marginal revenue. So when marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, as you can see down there, that's where you get your quantity. And that is, you can see the Q, and you compare that with QC. I've got QC there, which I think is the allocative efficient quantity. So again, what's being provided is considerably less. And you look at the price, so the price isn't at that level. You see that'd be a very low price, marginal cost equals to marginal revenue. No, the price is actually on the demand curve, which is actually really a lot higher than what you get in perfect competition, monopolistic competition, or even oligopoly for that example. And basically the monopoly just wants to maximize their profits. They're not really interested in the consumers or their consumer surplus. Something I haven't mentioned in my other videos, I don't think yet. I mentioned in my posts about what consumer surplus is. Since I've just mentioned the word now, I might as well describe what that is. So consumer surplus is the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. And when you've got a higher price, that willingness to pay difference and what you actually pay is a lot smaller. And there'll be a lot of people that have a willingness to pay below that price, so they're not going to buy that anymore. And their willingness to pay is not like, oh yeah, I want to buy that, whatever. It's often related to if they can pay, So it's willingness and ability to pay, shall I say, is probably a better description of it. And by having a high price, people that essentially may need that particular product can't get that anymore. And that's what you'd be getting with your private monopoly, should I say. So this is more of a private monopoly structure, which there's many of them as well. But in order for your government monopolies to operate, you'd think effectively they'd be operating under this sort of structure as well. So anyway, so this is a little bit different from your oligopoly, which I mentioned about the kink demand curve. You don't have to worry about that. This time it's just straightforward marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So a little bit like monopolistic competition. Key difference is though, you'll see your demand curves are going to be a little bit more steeper. And why that is the case is because it's a monopoly and there's very, very few substitutes to this. Like, for example, electricity. What is your substitute for electricity in your house? There really isn't, Whereas with a monopolistic competition, like I've got my Marvel t-shirt here, they raise the price of Marvel t-shirts, I go with a DC t-shirt, it's possible. No, to be honest, I don't like DC. I'll probably go with a Star Wars t-shirt. But anyway, there's more options out there, so you have a flatter demand curve for monopolistic competition, and you have a steeper demand curve for monopolies. And we call that relatively more inelastic. Do you call it? Yeah, inelastic. See, the inelastic demand, steeper demand curve. There's ways of working through that. I went through the mathematics anyway in this video, but yeah, generally you get a more inelastic demand, that steeper demand curve, and which is effectively pushing your price up higher. So anyway, so that's for you guys who want to know a little bit about the economics in terms of graphs and stuff like that. Just a bit of fun, hope you like that. Alright, so what about government and government regulation? So we talked about private monopolies, and they can set their prices, as we mentioned before, basically to maximize profit. Governments can regulate monopolies. They could also regulate it in the sense that it's not a monopoly, but if it stays as a monopoly, they can do that, and they can put in taxes, for example. You could add a tax. So effectively, what would you want to put a tax on? You'd want to put a tax on, oh my gosh, I can forget what it is now. I think it's in the written description, sorry about this, I can't remember off the top of my head. But a combination of taxes and subsidies anyway, you can actually raise the quantity sold and lower the price. I think we've got lump sum subsidies that will do that. Do we have a lump sum subsidy? I think that's the case. Again, check the thing, I can't remember off the top of my head. Alright, what have we got here? Oh, I actually go into that now. I wasn't even looking at my next slide, so apologies. So we've got a price ceiling. Here we go. So that is one way of regulation, how you can do this. You can put a price ceiling, so that means monopolies can't set their price above that price there. That's a little bit different from what I was talking about before, about a combination of subsidies and taxes, wasn't it? Yes. So this is a price ceiling. So government can put in place a price ceiling, so therefore firms cannot charge above a particular price. So therefore they would charge a lower price, and then they've got incentive then to produce a higher quantity. So that's one way of going about that. Alright, so almost at the end now. So when I talk about monopolies, I've talked a lot about mostly about government monopolies and inefficiency around that compared to private monopolies. Put it this way, if a government monopoly doesn't exist, it's not likely to become a private monopoly. What's more likely to happen is that the government pull out, becomes privatized, and you will probably form an oligopoly, I would say, most likely. It could even break down into monopolistic competition in the future, potentially as well, but let's mostly go with oligopolies. So what happens with an oligopoly? You have competition. So you've got incentive to lower your prices. Well, should I say, you've got incentive to lower your costs, which would then help you lower your prices. So in a sense, that is better for society. It's better for the people who are buying it because you got lower costs and therefore you get lower prices. If you're a monopoly, government monopoly, there isn't any incentive to be efficient. And that's where we talk about markets, in the sense that you get that pressure, you get that competition in order to bring the best out. And if your firm can't manage, can't survive, then you go out of business. Government monopolies, they don't go out of business because they simply can't. I think you can even talk about, is it risk, I'm trying to think of the word now, not risk aversion. Oh my gosh, adverse selection, no, it's not adverse selection. Moral hazard, that's the one, I always get stuck on that one. Moral hazard, so no matter how badly a government does, it doesn't matter because they'll always have taxpayer money coming in, so regardless of how badly they stuff up, it doesn't matter. And that's what moral hazard, as we saw even with private banks back in 2008, they got bailed out by governments, wasn't it? If they weren't bailed out by governments, they would have gone under, but they were considered too large to fail, so they say anyway. And that created moral hazard in that context. If you guys, have been watching the movie Wall Street, you'd know what I mean by moral hazard in that sense. So it is very dangerous because that fear of failure, that fear of going out of business, is a good incentive to actually become more efficient and do a better job. All right, so that brings me to the end of Monopoly. Hopefully I didn't stumble around too much. Like I said, I couldn't remember my stuff in regards to subsidies. I can remember it's a combination of subsidies and taxes you can use to lower your price and raise your quantity. You have to remember that. Probably look in the written one to actually get the exact description on those. So anyway, apology about that. So what are the key things with Monopoly anyway? So Monopoly, one seller, normally many buyers. There's normally, well I shouldn't say normally, there's always very strong barriers to entry. Only got one firm. If it's government, then you just can't enter. They just completely restrict it, forbid it. In private sector, they can be quite strong as well. It could be, could be through patents. It could be through the cost of entering, the infrastructure costs involved, economies of scales and things like that. But the key thing to remember with monopolies, it is that one firm, or the one firm that is controlled a very large percentage of the market. And very often, monopolies are very inefficient, and possibly the most inefficient market structure you can get. So there you go. It takes us to the end of Monopoly. Hope you liked this video. If you did, it didn't too much on my little gaffes here and there, you'll give me that upvote. And if you're following me, that's great. If you're not, hopefully you can follow me. If you're watching me on if you're not watching me on Steam or one of the on the blockchain, then hopefully you will be giving me, I think it's a like, isn't it, on other platforms, or subscribe, or something along that lines. Well, anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I still got a few more videos to go in this series. You still got Monopsony and Oligopsony as well, and you guys on Steam will probably be quite interested in what I have to say about Oligopsony. All right, thank you very much.